Well, good afternoon, everyone. And a shout out, special thanks to Sarah from the Macmillan Center who chose today's music. That was Dave Brubeck, probably his quartet, sounded like a quartet. Thank you, Sarah. I'm David Blight, Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center. This is another edition of the GLC at Lunch. And before I introduce our special guest, Christine DeLucia, our Associate Director, Michelle Zaks, has one or two announcements. Michelle.
I'll just post the announcements in the chat, David.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Well, then let's get right down to business. Christine DeLucia did her PhD here at Yale in 2009. I had the privilege of being a reader on her amazing dissertation. She has taught at both Mount Holyoke College up in the Pioneer Valley and now for several years at Williams College. She did her BA at Harvard. Her first book, which was the original dissertation here at Yale, is a marvelous study of historical memory. It's called Memory Lands, King Philip's War and the Place of Violence in the Northeast. Christine is an innovative, important scholar of historical memory and the way historical memory can be traced through material culture, through landscapes, through archaeology, and various other means. And she is now about to finish, and I think is soon to turn into Yale Press, her next book, which is entitled The Itineraries, Knowledge, Sovereignty, and Freedom in the 18th Century Northeast, which we're going to hear about today. But I do want to do a special thank you here publicly, Christine. Christine read at least one of our chapters for us on the Yale and Slavery book, especially the first chapter, which has so much in it about the native peoples of Connecticut before there ever was a Yale College here. And she's currently a fellow here at the GLC. She's also helping us out, advising on a major project that came out of the Yale and Slavery book, which is a 4-year effort to reach secondary teachers about Native American and African American and New England history. So, Christine, a warm welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, David, and I appreciate everyone who's joining today. It's been a marvelous time to be at the GLC, and I thank everyone for conversations, ideas, especially Daisha Brabham about education and the ways that this work reverberates in the world. So I'm going to share my screen so that we have some images to take a look at as I go along. And what I am bringing to you today are a few threads from my current book project, which, as David mentioned, is midway, on the way to completion, really focused on the 18th century North American Northeast and the work that communities have long been doing to secure their own stability, freedom, and futures. So to get right into this, I want to begin with a recognition of where these days I live and work in the homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican community and tribal nation, and their own work in educating, in sharing out resources, in regathering materials about the 18th century and much longer experiences has been profoundly formative to my own thinking, and something that I'm grateful to be connecting with. And this that I'm sharing, Williams College, We Are Walking on Mohican Lands, is an interpretive text that the community has led, working with some students at Williams College to engage in truth-telling and share out more full and accurate understandings of Indigenous and colonial relationships. And why I wanted to start here is because it's important to situate ourselves. And for me, the work of scholarship and education is also very much about the present day. And I want to recognize an effort led by students where I teach that they titled Go Beyond the Land Acknowledgement. I know that many of us have heard land acknowledgements recently may understand where they come from and their importance. And I appreciate at the deepest level this effort to push institutions beyond simply words and into meaningful actions and relationships. And related to this, also want to spotlight, because this is a method and an ethic in my own work, want to spotlight the ongoing intergenerational work that the Stockbridge-Munsee community themselves has undertaken and continues to lead. And for any folks on this call who may be up in their homelands, I encourage visiting a brilliant public history exhibition called Our Lands, Our Home, Our Heart, that is in the town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And this has much to do with the 18th century, which is the focus of my presentation today. As a little bit of a preview of where I'm heading with you this afternoon, there is also a really significant connection between the Mohican Nation and Yale College in the 18th century. So we'll circle back to that in a little bit. But this is where I am inviting us to spend some time today, in the coast of Connecticut, multiple Indigenous homelands, and communities, towns, villages, and networks spanning this extraordinary place, both the land and the water and the points at which they meet. And I will return to this as we go along, but just to get us a little bit oriented, today I am speaking from homelands of the Quinnipiac people and nation. And as I unfurl some threads of this story, we'll be giving a sense of this larger region across which so many relationships between Native nations, with Native nations and colonizers, and between Indigenous people and African American people have developed over many centuries. And these are some of the guiding questions that I would bring to us today. The book that I am completing focuses on the 18th century, and I didn't really anticipate at the outset that it was in part going to be a study of the American Revolution, told through very different vantages than those that have been often most popularized in this area. And the questions that have been on my mind as I have formulated this project over a number of years are these. In a time of tremendous upheaval, how did Indigenous and African American individuals, families, communities, and sovereign nations conceptualize and enact greater security, well-being, justice, and liberation? What do these keywords mean for distinct communities? How do they evolve over time? How do they put intense pressure on colonial systems that are often at odds of these goals, right? Or deliberately designed to suppress those? And so what I would like to share today are some of the strategies that communities in this region undertook in the 18th century in order to advocate for and secure these priorities. A bit of context before getting into those specific stories. And this is really important for my own method. It has been since I began this work many years ago to locate this within the longstanding efforts led by communities. And those include Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, and African American communities. And the amount of public history, programming, research, genealogy, education that communities have undertaken for many, many generations is profound. It has shaped my thinking at every turn. And I wanted to share a few examples on this screen of projects and interventions led by communities and nations. And I say this so that we don't even inadvertently slip into some kind of scholarly discovery narrative in which academics are the first to find something out or the first to think about something, but rather to locate this within longstanding community trajectories of knowledge production, of memory, and of social intervention. Also want to highlight that for Indigenous nations, relationships with colonial institutions, including Yale University, go back a very long ways, as I'll touch on today, including the 18th century, and have continuing significance in the 21st. And to mention one extremely important example of that, work by the Mohegan Nation to secure the repatriation or return of ancestors and meaningful belongings from collections of museums such as the Yale Peabody Museum. And this work of diplomacy extends across many, many centuries, right? So some of my hope today in speaking about the 18th century is to help us see in a longer perspective the actions currently unfolding in the 21st. As David mentioned, my first book, Memory Lands, began my thinking, writing about these topics. And when I reached the end of it, I was really compelled by the ongoing stories and how communities who survived some of the most profound upheavals of the 17th century, including violence, including attempted genocide and epidemic disease, how communities regrouped, reoriented, sustained themselves, and strategized about their next steps. And this rather organically took me into the 18th century. As one example of this kind of strategizing from the immediate aftermath of King Philip's War and Indigenous resistance movement, I was fascinated to find this document in a colonial archive in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It has the signatures and the marks of 3 Wampanoag representatives who are taking active steps to secure their continuing right to the land, their own homelands. And not only land as private property, but something much bigger and much more indigenous in this case. And that is protecting the plants, the animals, the whales, the birds, who are all part of this homelands and all forms of life. And when I came across this in the archive, it really set me on a different path in accounting for the continuity of communities in the aftermath of the 1670s and those violences. And that is where my current project has gravitated. So just a couple other points of orientation, and then I'll take us down into some specific threads of these stories. The field of Native American and Indigenous studies is vibrant and growing and has offered methods and ethics for scholars and practitioners that urge us to approach the very process of research differently. And here I want to highlight work by Jeannie O'Brien, in which she talks about archives. And she's counteracting assumptions, as she writes, that have regarded Indigenous history as marginal, have claimed that rich and thorough archives about Indigenous experiences were sparse or non-existent. She says, in fact, as recent scholarship has amply demonstrated, Indigenous peoples have been producing written documentation of and about their lives for hundreds of years. There is, as she asserts, an abundance of documentation to support the pursuit of Indigenous histories. No longer can it be claimed that the sources just don't exist to do justice to that history. And I've really taken up her remarks here as a prompt, as a motivator to be thinking carefully and expansively about archives, including forms of writing created by communities in order, like the document we just looked at, to advocate for their own security and well-being in the future. I also have been inspired by O'Brien's emphasis on what she terms unexpected archives that have been underutilized and unappreciated. And this has taken me to I will say, wide array of local collections across the Northeast, meaning public libraries, town historical societies, community-led organizations, tribal archives, libraries, and museums, where materials about the past have often come through family connections and through the creative and critical commitments of communities to locating materials about their own experiences. And in this sense, what I'm sharing with you today really does manifest an unexpected archives approach that also includes the land itself, material belongings, and other forms of knowing that are not written but are extremely important. Another touchstone for this work are interventions in tellings of US history. And here I want to recognize work by Ned Blackhawk that has recently won outstanding accolades, The Rediscovery of America. And as Blackhawk, who gave a presentation about this at Williams College, actually my first year there, has remarked, quote, "I believe that to really engage US history requires unmaking the received wisdoms, practices, temporalities, and spatial frameworks that have long structured the realm of American professional historical inquiry." And this is the spirit of what I am sharing with you today, this critical unmaking in order to approach through very different lenses and very different storylines, Indigenous experiences, past, present, and future. So with these as a bit of a critical framework, let me bring us today into a particular space that some people on this call may know well. For others, this may be a new site to be thinking with. As you can see from the image featured in the Yale Daily News in 2016, a plaque was installed at Ezra Stiles College, one of the residential colleges at Yale University. And I will read the text of it. At the top, it has the names of 3 individuals, Newport, Jacob, and Aaron. And the text below says this: as a leading minister and intellectual in the 18th century, Ezra Stiles controlled the lives of 3 young people. 2 were African Americans, and 1 was Native American, Western Niantic. 1 was a slave, he was manumitted, and the others were indentured servants, but none were free. We remember them here. And I have appreciated very much initial conversations with folks associated with Ezra Stiles College about the origins of this, the impacts, and what the future of it may be. But here are some of the questions that I'm thinking about, because my book takes up the lives of these individuals and many others in order to bring forward some other vantages. Excuse me. So we might be thinking, who are Aaron Waukee and Newport and Jacob Freeman? What relations do they have with their communities, each other, and Ezra Stiles? Whose stories are made visible or submerged or left out in commemorative installations like this? And I'm sure each of us can think of plaques or monuments or markers in our own familiar places that attempt to do this kind of recognizing and making visible work. And then perhaps the most pressing question, what happens beyond the plaque? How can we be thinking collectively in many different communities about doing more than marking? What kinds of education, social transformation, and accountability may be required in order to take this work to its fullest extent? So for the rest of my time this afternoon, I would like to pick up the threads of these stories and share out a little bit more about their lives. So beginning with Aaron Waukee and thinking about the place that he came as a 9-year-old boy when he was indentured into the household of Ezra Stiles, then the president of Yale College. I think it's really important to begin on the land and to have a recognition that Indigenous people in this region have long maintained relationships with lands, water, and other beings that are crucial to sustenance. And in some fashion, Aaron Waukee's indenture to Ezra Stiles is a disruption to longstanding intergenerational cycles of knowledge and thriving. He is taken out of customary home places and he is sent into a colonial college, not to matriculate as a student, but to labor there, and ostensibly to gain access to English literacy and Protestant Christianity. So a little bit of longer context to these experiences. And here is, I think, a hallmark of my own work that really comes from things that community members have impressed upon me, that the story does not begin in the 18th century, doesn't begin in the 17th. It begins in the very earliest times, as Indigenous people have maintained homelands since time out of mind. So the place where Aaron Waukee is sent, in 1782, the homelands of the Quinnipiac people. This is where New Haven exists today. And as you can see from this map from the mid-17th century, these are deep Indigenous homelands that are part of a regional network of Native nations and polities. In 1638, on the direct heels of the genocidal colonial action known as the Pequot War, in which English authorities and colonial troops, along with Native allies, attempted to extinguish Pequot people, particularly at the place known as Mystic. In the aftermath of this is when New Haven is established as a colonial town. And I think it's absolutely vital to emphasize that the establishment of New Haven did not eliminate Quinnipiac people. They did not remove forever from this place. They instead entered into extremely nuanced and significant negotiations with colonizers around land. And one of the outcomes of this was the establishment of a Quinnipiac reservation on the eastern side of New Haven. And this is one map that has been made visible through work from the Native Northeast Research Collaborative to show, right, that Quinnipiac people are maintaining this land across a number of generations, despite the efforts of New Haven founders to displace them. The 9-square grid of colonial New Haven is established upon longstanding Quinnipiac homelands. And in my work, I'm very interested in the ways that colonial settlements, formations are actually strongly shaped by Indigenous place knowledge. And the planting fields, the canoe crossings, paths, and other forms of placemaking in which communities have been engaged for so long. If we're thinking about the impacts of New Haven, colonization, and also Yale College, eventually upon Indigenous peoples in this region, to understand Aaron Wakeat's trajectory, right, within a longer arc of time, we also need to be thinking about religion. And it is very early in contacts with English colonizers that Quinnipiac people are being impacted by Christian missionization. And the image here is a few pages from a text by Abraham Pearson, one of the early leaders in Yale College, who is deeply committed to attempting to convert Quinnipiac and possibly other regional Native communities to Christianity, and understands this as part of a, quote, civilizing project that is designed to, over time, eventually extinguish traditional Indigenous ways of knowing and of relating and of political sovereignty. So this is beginning to impact Native nations as early as 1658. Right? Moving ahead a little bit in time, again, part of this longer trajectory of relationships between Indigenous people, New Haven, and Yale College. In the 1730s, leadership of the Mohican tribal nation sent 2 of their young people to live at Yale College with tutor John Sargent, one of the colonial teaching staff at Yale. And this happened as a result of a lot of community decision-making as they were beginning to interact much more closely with English colonizers in the town of Stockbridge. And you can see here an amazing walking tour that the community has developed. And to understand that their sending of their most cherished young people to a place like Yale was part of their own strategy, right? Perhaps a way of ensuring that these youth would gain access to forms of English literacy that they then could bring back home and assist the community in defending their lands, engaging with the English court system and with English Christian authorities. And I think also important to say, because this bears such resonances with Aaron Wakeat's eventual experiences, the community brings the children home within a short span of time. They do not send the children permanently to Yale, to New Haven. They do this for several seasons, and then they bring them back. And that process of bringing home is something that I've been thinking about a lot, that the plaque from Ezra Stiles College, for instance, doesn't tell us that Aaron Wakeat is brought home by his mother within a year of being sent to Yale. But if we look at this within longer Indigenous contexts, it is very much a through line in Native communities' own strategies as they are thinking about the futures and the well-being of their children. A few decades before Aaron Wakeat comes to Yale, Samson Occam comes to Yale. He attends commencement, and he writes about this in his journal. Samson Occam, a leading figure within the Mohican tribe, a minister, an educator, a community activist and organizer. And among the points of this to emphasize is that Samson Occam was not allowed to matriculate at Yale. He had intense education in the types of schooling that would have been required for matriculation, but is not ultimately enrolled as a student at Yale. And so this is another phenomenon that I have been parsing, how many Native people came to Yale University and to New Haven and spent time there, but not as enrolled students, and what it meant to be relegated to the margins in the view of the colonial institution, but also to consider this from the vantage of Native actors themselves and their motivations for strategically, at different moments, coming to and then departing Yale University. So that, as a brief sketch, right, gives us some context for understanding Aaron Waukeet's time at Yale. And here, sharing an image that shows what one view of the college may have looked like in the 18th century, and stressing that this is a place that is not only a colonial space. It is also a space, certainly as the Yale and Slavery Project has emphasized, where Indigenous, African-American, and Euro-colonial people are present in very different ways and exercise different types of autonomy and decision-making as they interact with the university. This is an occasion to think more deeply and critically about one of the formative presidents of Yale and to investigate the longer arc of his life and to see these episodes of indenture not as anomalous or kind of one-off incidents, but actually part of the entire pattern of his life. So this portrait, which you can see at Yale Art Gallery, I have made an initial effort at recaptioning. How might we approach Ezra Stiles differently if we recognize that for his entire life, he is involved in systems of settler colonialism, racial slavery, and racial capitalism? Or to put it otherwise, that he is a claimer of enslaved and indentured people across the whole arc of his adult life. And among these is Aaron Waukeet. So part of what I am doing in this project is resituating these stories and actually sending Ezra Stiles quite far off stage on this in order to make sure the communities themselves are centered. And in this case, it means saying a bit. There's a lot to say, but here I'll say just a bit about the communities from which Aaron Waukeet is coming. So as a young Niantic boy in the 1770s, early 1780s, what kinds of experiences is his community having? And how might this help us understand much more fully and critically why his mother agreed under extremely difficult circumstances for him to spend time at Yale in an indentured capacity? This is a map that Ezra Stiles drew, and of the Niantic community as he saw it in the 1760s when he visited this area. And this map is both useful and not useful. On one hand, it does tell us something about how visible Indigenous communities were, even to colonial outsiders like Stiles as he traveled through here. On the other hand, this community had its own understandings of place, many of which did not register to Stiles. So to show you a couple examples of that, and here locate us in a bit of a different geography that is not so structured by a colonial archive. Right now, we're talking about Niantic, and particularly the area around Black Point, where the Niantic community has, one part of them has long been based. Niantic people in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s had a thriving community here. And this is something that Stiles himself witnessed and heard about when he visited in 1761. And he spent time sketching some of the homes of the extended Waukeet family. So I mention this because it is crucial to our story here that the Waukeet family in its extended form knew Ezra Stiles. They had known him for decades. They were familiar with him. They knew his intentions. They knew how he operated, and that this had to have factored in to the decision around the indenture in the 1780s, that this was not a transaction happening in a kind of abstracted marketplace, but rather coming out of deep relationships and the critical perspectives of the community. I also want to emphasize from this drawing Indigenous agency. And if you read the handwriting along the side of this sketch, sort of a schematic drawing of George Waukeet's wigwam or his dwelling, it is very clear that Stiles is not alone here. He is in fact being conducted through this community by George Waukeet, one of the community leaders himself, and says that everything that he's seeing and writing down is, quote, as I was told on the spot by George and by Ben Uncas, who's also present sachem of the Mohegans. This really changes the perspective on these documents currently held at Beinecke Library, to know that they are being shaped at every turn by the intentions of Niantic and Mohegan people. And this also should have us thinking about what is not mapped, what is not shown. All of the places that George Lockheed, Ben Uncas, and other communities members would have directed styles away from. And perhaps these were places where women, children, elders were. Perhaps they were sensitive, sacred, or otherwise community-only type of places. Perhaps there were areas that they did not want him to know about because of important resources, right? And so all of this, I think, can offer us an important kind of critical view that takes into account what is not visible and how that may be part of a community strategy in order to not show many, many important facets of their own lives. Something else that I would emphasize in critically rereading Styles' manuscripts and other colonial documents is that he is writing from a particular ethnocentric perspective of a white colonizer who is strongly convinced about what the future of Native nations will look like, and very invested in forms of assimilation and what he assumes is eventual disappearance in certain fashion. This is clearly not the actual experience of communities, but it's a mythology and a perspective that Styles is bringing to bear. And the way that this shows up in some of his records is that he does not make visible so many of the forms of dwelling, living, practice, political commitments that communities have in the late 18th century that are very much expressions of their own modernity. So for example, when Styles is spending time with the Wakiits and others at Niantic, he is only drawing wituash, so traditional style homes, of which there are many. Many community members are living in these in the 18th century. What he's not showing are timber framed houses, and there are also many of those present in the community. And these have been taken up by different Native communities in the 17th, 18th century as part of their own dynamic experiences and experimentations with vernacular architecture. And if you're interested in this, I would point to a couple really prominent examples. In the 18th century, Samson Occam himself lived in a timber-framed house in Mohegan homelands, perhaps with his study or his library in this associated building, or maybe in another location where he kept all of his books and met so many people. This, as you can see from this map from Melissa Tanner-Quidgen-Zobel's amazing book, Medicine Trail, Samson Occam's home site is right in the heart of Mohegan homelands, and is part of his own, continuance of living in the center of community, but also he is transforming, adapting, and very much part of the 18th century Atlantic world. On another sketch of his house, it has a lot of resemblances. I've been interested to notice to a similar timber-framed house that a Narragansett leader named King Tom had built in his own homelands just to the east a little bit later in the 18th century. And one more example from Joseph Jeffrey, Niantic Narragansett community member. This house is still standing in Narragansett homelands today, and it has become claimed as a private residence. But all of this is to say, right, that the experiences of Aaron Lockheed, his mother Ruth, and other Niantic community members in the 18th century were extremely dynamic. They were transforming, and yet what has been represented by someone like Styles tends to constrain those stories. And one other example from a collaborative archaeology project that the Eastern Pequot tribal nation has led over many years, focused on 18th and 19th century home places on their own lands. So the landscape at Niantic is transforming. The community by the 1780s is under extreme stress. This is a result of multiple decades of colonial attempted dispossession and fragmenting of the land base. As we're trying to understand this indenture, I would also stress this, that the Revolutionary War, which by 1782 is in its roughly 7th year, has placed extreme hardship upon the community and left many community members widowed. So Indigenous women at Niantic, and Ruth Lockheed herself is documented to be widowed at this point in time. And that information seems to matter a great deal in understanding her own challenges, her hardships, and how she might have been strategizing to provide support for her young son, as she had lost her husband in the context of likely the revolution, but it could have been prior conflicts or other events as well. And this is something that is impacting many Native nations in the 18th century. Here I have a passage from Hendrik Oppermaat, a Mohican leader, who writes a petition in the latter part of the war to the colonial government, trying to secure support for especially the women in the community. He writes, "Our young men have been employed in the present war against the common enemy, and many have lately fell in battle. Their widows are now left to care of themselves and their children, without help from their husbands, who at this season of the year provided for their families by hunting." And then goes on to explain particular needs that the Mohican community has at this moment as a consequence of war. So all of this, right, the extreme upheavals of the 1780s, but also preceding decades, are the important context for understanding why Aaron Lougheed would have been sent to live and labor in the president's house, which is shown on this 18th century map. And what his experiences would have been there might have been, right? That is something that I'm not going to focus on here now, but happy to talk about in some of the Q&A, with the emphasis that he is brought back home by his mother in 1783. He is supposed to spend many years in this household in an indenture, but seemingly his mother, Ruth, breaks that indenture early and brings him home. And that is some of the work I've been doing to follow out their trajectory after he leaves this space of incarceration and confinement, and real, potential for abuse and other difficulties in this colonial setting. What his life was once she brought him home and brought him back to either Killingworth, where she had been living, or Black Point area, or other places in Niantic geographies. I'm going to skip a couple of these for a moment because I want to make sure, as I wrap up here, to point to an intersection with Aaron Lougheed's life. And this is another significant part of my book project, the lives of Newport and Jacob Freeman, who are two African-American family members. Their lives intersect with Aaron Lougheed's in the 1780s when they converge at the college president's house. And then they diverge, and they too wind up going to other locations after a certain time in New Haven. And some of what I have been working on is the longer arc of Newport's life, from his being seized as a child in West Africa, trafficked to Rhode Island, enslaved in the household of Ezra Stiles, and then his life continues to unfold from there in both unfreedom and freedom, constrained at every turn, but also full of his own strategy and envisioning of a future. And this image, which featured on the promo for this talk, is the parsonage house in Newport, Rhode Island, in which young Newport, as a child and then as an adolescent and a young man, was forced to labor. This is Ezra Stiles' parsonage across the way from the Second Congregational Church. So also having us think about the deep complicity and enslavement of Protestant leadership in New England. And wanted, from a public history vantage, as I tie these threads together, to have us dwell for a moment critically on which of these stories are told, which are not. And when I have gone to visit the area where the parsonage is situated in Clark Street today, it's been notable to me what the public signage is. And as you can see on the left of this, the house today, which is a privatized residence, is called the Ezra Stiles House. And the description of it says nothing about Stiles' active enslaving of Newport, nor the fact that Stiles had been involved in human trafficking before that, in relation to his father, Isaac Stiles. And in fact, the language here emphasizes Stiles on aligning with Samuel Hopkins, another minister, to, quote, campaign against slavery and to help with the education of African Americans. So in fact, what is told on the sign is an anti-slavery narrative, when the actual reality of Newport at this house was quite the opposite of that, right? So the need for signage like this to be more accurate and to acknowledge really forthrightly the the fuller story. Something I have been wrestling with as I think about archives are the labor, the knowledge that Newport brought to this place. And among the forms of work that he is forced to do in Newport, the town of Rhode Island, is support Ezra Stiles' interest in silk cultivation. Stiles believed that silkworms could be grown profitably in New England. And as a result of this operation in which Newport was actively involved in gathering the mulberry that feeds the silkworms and in harvesting and processing them, there was some silk produced. And there are some swatches of this that are currently held at the Beinecke Library. And I've been thinking about this in relation to work on cotton production that has been so powerful by scholars focusing on enslavement and material production. And how might the story be different if we think about silk as also coming through these channels of forced labor? And then finally, the place where I want to end today, so we have time for some discussion, is thinking intersectionally. That in all of the places where Newport lived, where Aaron Waukee moved, there are deep, abiding ties of kinship, of political solidarity, of social advocacy between Indigenous and African American communities, and also Afro-Indigenous communities who organize and sustain themselves over many generations. And the work in this field of intersectional history by Taya Miles, Kyle Mays, Tiffany Lethabo King, and many others, as well as communities themselves, is a formative structure for everything that I'm thinking about, because these are not separate histories. They are co-created, co-experienced, and offer some routes to go much more deeply into both converging and diverging understandings that communities maintained of freedom, liberation, and sovereignty or political autonomy. So to draw this to a conclusion, I'll say just a little bit more about Newport Freeman's own trajectory, because Freeman is the surname he takes on when he is manumitted. As a consequence of the American Revolution, the Stiles family gets out of Newport, Rhode Island, and they head north to New Hampshire, the Piscataqua region, or Abenaki homelands. And in this place, Newport eventually attains his freedom. And would highlight here that my understandings of this have been really shaped by work of the Black Portsmouth Heritage Initiative. And it is within that context, and I'll stop here, that Newport and Violet Freeman, who he has married, and their son Jacob come to Yale. And we cannot understand these stories without these longer arcs, without these pathways, both into and then out of places like Yale, and knowing that the story continues. So happy to have some questions, discussion about this, and thank you so much for listening to this work in progress.
Thank you, Christine. That was wonderful. And everyone out there, we welcome your questions. A few have come in, but I want more. Send us your thoughts. Let me start though. You mentioned right out front this idea of negotiation. I found that fascinating when trying to understand, 17th century Connecticut, despite all of this warfare, terrible warfare against the native peoples, that nevertheless, the cultures develop side by side to some degree through a process of negotiation. Could you talk a bit more about negotiating how and over what and for what? I mean, was this often economic and material? Though it's not entirely economic and material, is it? It's cultural as well. It's trying to sustain autonomy, et cetera. Tell us more about that, because that's a huge part of the whole New England native story.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this. And this is part of what compelled me about the project that I'm working on, the intertwining, the extremely close intertwining politically, socially, economically, culturally of Native, colonial, and African-American people and communities, and the different commitments, forms of agency that each brought to that to make a space that at every turn is being shaped by multiple interests, often in asymmetric relationships of power, right? And to not lose sight of that. But among the things I would say is that, even starting the story about negotiation before colonization, to recognize that Native nations have immensely long-standing protocols of intertribal diplomacy, and that is some of the, the crucial framework for this. And within that, the English and the Dutch and the French, right, they try to insert themselves, but knowing from the vantage of Native nations that they are long accustomed to interacting with outsiders and developing strategies for affirming rights, for coming to shared understandings. And I think that puts a different kind of container for all of this, right? Recognizing that. In terms of relationships with colonizers, particularly among the priorities that Native nations are ceaselessly advocating for in the 18th century, maintaining homelands in the face of relentless colonizer expansion. And here, when I say expansion, I mean expansion of colonial farms on which enslaved people are forced to labor. That requires more and more acreage. Nonetheless, Native nations are doing everything they can through treaties, through petitions, through on-the-ground resistance to maintaining their home places, because the land under their feet and the waters are the future, right? Without that, it is very hard to maintain sovereignty and stability if the land itself has been taken. And I see that as one of the crucial sites of negotiation in which everything else intersects with that.
Land and water too, right? I mean, the rivers, the coastline of Long Island. I mean, of Long Island Sound. I mean, these many of these peoples, especially along the coast, were maritime peoples, great fishermen, and so they're kind of learning to negotiate as they can waterways as well, right? I mean,
absolutely, and something I didn't touch on here, but
sides in this, but it's very contested. That whole coastline became
well, so right after Aaron Waukee goes home, right, he returns in 1783 to his mother, and what's happening in the Nahantah community, among their priorities are petitioning the colonial Connecticut government, now state of Connecticut government, around water river issues, that their ability to maintain fishing practices on the rivers are being threatened by white colonial violence and encroachments. And so they're ceaselessly petitioning the legislature to make sure that those, the river frontage and the fishing rights are maintained, and do not get traction in the ways that they are seeking initially. But this continues, of course, right through the present.
Before I have some questions now. Before I wanted to just throw one more out, if you don't mind. You said very intriguingly a fair amount about what's visible and not visible as sources, or as as the creativity of Native people. What becomes visible, or in other words, yes, some material piece is visible. Wampum is visible. The writing, the documents you showed, visible. But this has been a huge question, of course, in slavery studies too, for a very long time now. How do we get at that which is not as visible, existed in the realm of, in the case of, African-American slaves, a kind of a non-literate world of cultural creativity, a world of folk culture? How as scholar do you get at the invisible?
Yes.
You do that a lot with your memory.
Yeah, and this is, I think we're an interdisciplinary approach that's grounded in particular methods and ethics, that also respects that sometimes forms of knowledge are deliberately not shared out, right, and are not intended to become visible. And that has shaped some of the things that I say and don't say in this book, right? There are some places that are clearly not for more public showing, right? among the ways that you can approach this, many oral traditions that have taken on different forms, some of which have been recorded, written down, published by communities, some of which have been shared through forms of education, public activism. I think a lot about organizing out on the land, and when there are protests or I had an image at the outset of the National Day of Mourning at Plymouth, which is a gathering in Wampanoag homelands that has taken place every year since 1970 on the Thanksgiving holiday. That has created an archive. There's a rich photo documentary archive, multimedia, but there's also the experience of people gathering there. And sometimes a textual archive may have just a mention of that.
Yeah.
That then is the prompt, as I hear in your question, to some forms of speculation or I would say very thoughtful narrative about what might have been, and thinking with Saidiya Hartman and others about critical fabulation, the importance of that, but then also places where there is not grounding to say, right, what might have occurred. For me, material culture has been extremely important, and belongings themselves, including the act of bringing home, the communities have been doing, and that expands, right, the forms of knowledge production immensely, to get us out of just kind of textual written archives.
Right.
Yeah, also monuments, and I didn't share in this presentation, but just yesterday when I was driving back into New Haven, there is a monument to the Revolutionary War that you and others may have seen called the Defenders Monument. It's located at the intersection of Congress and Columbus Avenues at the entrance to the Hill neighborhood.
Right.
And it is I have a lot of questions about this monument from the early 20th century, featuring the Revolutionary Defense of New Haven, and the three figures on it are three white colonial men, a Yale student, a farmer, and a merchant, who are the defenders of New Haven, right? And for me, when I work with monuments, it's always about, what is represented and why, what is not there, and how to...
And when was it put up by whom and why?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that monument commemorates the 1779 defense of New Haven?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have to go look at that again.
Yes.
But...
Well, I'm thinking about the contemporary on this too, the spatial politics of where these monuments have been installed and how they affect or engage by communities or not, right? And the Revolutionary War narrative, I should say, in New Haven New Haven and coastal Connecticut is so much an American patriotic one. And to recognize, from the sources that for African American and Indigenous communities, the Revolution presented, in aligning with the British at different moments, all kinds of different opportunities that were potentially more important for their own security and liberation. But that story is not the prevalent public one.
No, the American Revolution was various kinds of civil wars, wasn't it? We have here's a question. Speaking of text, how would you change the words on the outdoor signage of the Ezra Stiles house? How would you reinterpret the words? And by Ezra Stiles house, this means the one up in Newport, I take it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. How would you, or have you been asked to change it? Maybe not.
I have not been asked, and my response always said, thank you so much for this question, because I know that it's not enough to just be a critic, right, of monuments, but rather, is there a process that could allow something more meaningful to come together? And my response is always, a site like that should be reaching out to communities who are most closely tied to these experiences, including in the town of Newport, Rhode Island today. There is vibrant work by African-American leaders, researchers around public history, and to see if there are intentions, desires there as part of, walking tours that they have already developed.
And in Bristol,
I think when I read,
by the way, Bristol, Rhode Island has a
absolutely
robust public history work going on about slavery.
Yeah, and I think, the question also brings to mind, because I have mentioned the Ezra Stiles College plaque at Yale, and I know that folks, there are very actively thinking about what could happen, what kind of conversations or next steps there might be. And of course, if anything that I'm working on could help support that in a meaningful way. happy.
Didn't Steve
Yeah.
Pitty work on that? I thought Steve Pitty worked on I don't know, the text, I think,
I
but
believe. Yeah.
he really
And when
worked.
when I look at that plaque, I think among the things that I've been writing about, reflecting on, are where are the women, right?
Uh-huh,
So Ruth Walkeed, but then also Violet Freeman and others, right,
uh-huh.
whose lives are very much affected by these same
Yeah.
transits and systems, but who are not kind of visibly recognized there, and yet their own relationships are distinct with all of these histories. And so is there a way
Oh my
for
goodness.
that to come
I think
forward more?
I think it's a perfect moment because there's a pretty robust effort afoot now. It's going to take a while to do a whole lot of new plaques, and I don't know about renaming, but a lot of new plaques, a lot of new signage and commemoration in relation to the Yale and Slavery Project. But that plaque itself could be on the list of
Mhm.
rewriting, reinterpreting. Why not? I mean, it's like anything else that can be revised.
Yeah, and what beyond the plaque, right? I think that for me,
Right.
including some conversations in the place where I am right now, uh, how can there be meaningful forms of relationships, accountability, material
Yeah.
support, just to name that really frankly, especially from wealthy private institutions, whose whole existence owes to these systems, right? As you and others have been documenting, what does that look like in the 21st century? And the place that I would always emphasize is listen to communities and
Yeah.
what they are stating as their priorities and what is most
Yeah.
urgent and
Yeah.
important.
We
Yeah.
have a question here about cultural looting, reappropriating, looting. He uses the word looting. Uh, I'm not perfectly clear where he wants this question to go, but you might take that up in relation to, say, whatever you know about the relationship the Peabody Museum here has with Native peoples in New England, or with the Wampanoag, or the Mashantucket Pequot. I think they've had some exchanges, haven't they? Or no?
Yes. Well, so thank you. This is a wonderful question and has so much to do with knowledge sovereignty, right? And
Yeah.
um, the structures of power, authority, responsibility around materials, how the stories are told,
Yeah.
who is acknowledged, credited in that. I'll say, in the Northeast, there are some really wonderful examples of, community knowledge sovereignty, like tribal libraries, archives, and museums. Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center has been in existence for many years and is centered on Pequot priorities, perspectives, as well as open to the public. The Tantaquidgeon Museum at Mohegan, right, and any number of other community-run places. And when I think about, repatriating, and at one level, that's a legal obligation that universities, anything that has ever received federal funding, are obliged through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation
Right.
Act
Right.
to engage in those returns, have been very slow in it in many cases, or resistant. But that's a foundational level. And then there is a level of storytelling, education, disseminating knowledge, and how to, like, where I'm at right now is how can, again, like, these wealthy institutions not be running these projects themselves necessarily, but instead seeing if there are forms of support, whether material,
Collaboration.
personnel in kind, that can, you know, directly go to the work that communities are already doing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
By the way, our dear friend Joy Burns, who worked with us a lot on the Yale and Slavery Project, who knows everything about New Haven monuments, just pointed out that Defenders Monument was placed in 1933, which is, I mean, that is an interesting. That's the same time they're naming all the colleges over here at Yale. I don't know if there's any connection, probably not. But the fact that
Thank
that
you.
was been done and paid for, I presume, by the city in the early 1930s, there is a lot of heritage revival going on in the.
Yes.
I
Well,
don't know the
I think
context.
the New Haven, then called the New Haven Colony Historical museum,
Colony Historical
what is
Society.
now the New Haven Museum. I think they may have been involved in that. And this, on to link back to the question on repatriation and returns of knowledge, for so many town, city, state historical societies,
Right.
just embarking on this reckoning with their own
Yeah.
involvement, complicity in these erasive, dispossessive narratives and practices. And I know that this is happening across the Northeast as well as nationally and internationally. And that's been, exciting to be part of some things, and also frustrating, I think, in different places when there's not a deeper commitment to those transformations, because it really requires a rethinking of everything, everything at those sites.
Speaking of rethinking, I have a question here now from Lois McMillan, who teaches in Grants Pass, Oregon. I've known Lois for years and years through teacher institutes. She literally tunes into these with her students. And so she has a question. This is a fat pitch for you, Christine, but she has her students reading at least parts of Ned Blackhawk's recent book. And she wonders how that book has influenced you.
Thank you so much, and thank you especially to any educators, students who are here. That is just wonderful to spend time in conversation. And please feel welcome to follow up with me if you'd like.
So Lois will.
Send me an email. Seriously, I
Right.
would appreciate that, and glad to talk. That book it recently won the National Book Award and comes out of this wave of Native and Indigenous studies scholarship that is really transforming the telling, the methods, the approaches, the timelines.
And that's
Among
been
the
going on
things,
a long time now, hasn't it?
yeah, and it was formative to me when I was at Yale as a graduate student, working first with Alyssa Mount Pleasant, magnificent scholar, and then Ned Blackhawk came here, and others have been part of community, intellectual community. I would say, among the most potent parts of that book is the emphasis on sovereignty. So the political distinctiveness of Native nations who engage in government-to-government relationships with the United States and also European empires, as well as with each other. And that this is very different than a kind of multicultural inclusion narrative. This is political distinctiveness. And Blackhawk's emphasis as well, that this is not extinguished in the 17th century and the 18th century. It doesn't just kind of erode over time and disappear. It is present and forceful and a live force in the 21st century and the future. And with that as a recognition, everything about United States history looks different, because is it the United States as one polity interacting with and amid 500 plus autonomous nations.
Right.
And to know that that is the bedrock of this place that we are, and I think is extraordinary. In terms of, you mentioned also the Pequots, and here, I do not speak on behalf of any nation, of course. My understanding is based on learning with and from materials by communities and others, is that there are long-standing histories between Native nations, and sometimes those became alliances and kinship and solidarities, and sometimes they became tense or difficult, right? And that has also shaped the story of Quinnipiac homelands and Quinnipiac leaders' own responses in the wake of the genocidal violence that they saw unleashed against Pequot people. Knowing that Pequot or Quinnipiac leaders are aware of that, how would that shape their interactions with these colonizers? And that's the unspoken story behind a lot of these land documents, knowing that they are being created under conditions of extreme duress, but also the savvy and goals of particular nations who have their own interests.
By the way, I agree. I did an event with Ned last year on his new book, and especially the second half of that book. It is the story of this idea of sovereignty and how it's always been caught up too with American notions of citizenship. I mean, it's a very complicated story. But you had sovereignty, you have sovereignty in the title of this next book, right? So
yes. And that, I should say, that means
It's
quite
not
specifically.
it's not just a 20th century idea by any means. It goes back, way back.
Absolutely not. And it is, specific, has specific forms, meanings for Native nations. I've also been thinking about sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy in African American communities for whom political organizing, political consciousness, structures take distinct forms, right? And how this, for example, there's a petition that African American people in Portsmouth organized during the Revolution, advocating for their own liberation.
Right.
And the use of petitioning, right, as a whole practice. There's petitioning from Native nations as well. There's also treaty making, right? And that's a different kind of site of interaction, the nation-to-nation treaty. And so understanding these as both converging, but then also having distinct
Very
formulations.
much part of that negotiation story. Wow, indeed. Yeah, in fact, those petitions, especially by those black soldiers in the Revolution, are priceless. I quoted from a whole bunch of them in the Yellow Slavery book. As long as they were in Connecticut, I used them. Gosh, we could go on and on here. I think I've run the questions dry from our audience. Our audience is a huge audience today. This is great. Shows the great salience of this subject and topic and how hot this field is. Can't wait for your next book, Christine. You're welcome here at the GLC anytime. If you need, you come back down, do some research. We got a desk over there. You can park your things there anytime you need to.
Thank you so much. And I just put my email down in the Q&A for any folks who want to get in touch. I would seriously welcome
Lois and
that.
her students in Oregon are probably already doing it. So, and you'll love it. I mean, next thing be careful. The next thing you may be on a video with her class by next week. So, which would be great. Anyway, well, Christine, thank you hugely for doing this. Thank you for this incredible audience that came today. And don't forget next week, folks, I think April the 3rd, another of our fellows, Michael Tuck, will be giving his talk called The Atlantic Slave Trade and the Cycle of Resistance Along the Gambia River in the 18th Century. So next week, same time, same place, same Zoom. Christine, thank you so much. You were terrific.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
You bet. See you. Take care. Goodbye out there, everyone.